So hello all, welcome to the final event of the film festival. It's a three-part series. In the previous two festivals, we looked at the themes of housing, and we looked at the capacity. We looked at art as a form of resistance, and this the theme of this week. This film festival is looking at vulnerability and the capacity to act. So really, for those who are not familiar with, those of you in the audience who are not very familiar with the DPU's work, these film festivals have been an opportunity for us to showcase the kind of research that we are doing, but also the kind of methods we work with in our research. So I'm not going to take up a lot of time because there is quite a few brilliant films to show, and I'm sure you will like to see that more. But just to, in terms of the format, the way it's going to work is I'm going to invite the four members of staff who are here to introduce the film a little bit, and then then play the film. So we will start with Cassidy. So Cassidy.
Thank you, Faraj. Thank you to everyone who's organized this film festival, including Rita, Karen, Alex, Hayam, I think, was part of the original group putting together the film. So I'm very pleased to be part of this. The film we're presenting today is called After the Rain, and I really like this film. I like the music and everything that is shown in it. The film was done by David McEwan, who's a graduate from DPU from the BUD program. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how this film came about. So we had a project that started in 2015 called Reducing Relocation Risk in Urban Areas. And this was a project that had quite a wide range of partners, including the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, us at DPU, the Latin American Social Science faculty, Alan Lavelle from Flaxo, as well as Makerere University and the Urban Action Lab. And the project ran for 2 years. It was funded by the Climate Development Knowledge Network. They funded a couple of other projects here in DPU. It was a very dynamic project. And essentially, in this project, we wanted to look at the various social and economic implications of climate-related resettlement and relocation policies. And we worked across 3 continents in doing this. So there was work that went on in India, in Kampala, in Uganda, as well as in Peru, in Colombia, and in Mexico across Latin America. So it's quite a wide project in which we had different partners working in different places looking at this particular issue. We came to looking at this issue because those of us in the project, we saw that there had been a lot of sort of resettlement programs that are being put forward in urban areas to deal with flooding risk, landslide risk, and these kind of risks. And we were quite concerned about this as a policy response. So we wanted to look at what were some of the social, political, and economic implications of this. Why is it being proposed? What were the impacts on people? What were the kind of responses that were done, etc. So we had a wide variety of cases. And we produced a lot of work. So there's a DPU website that has all these different publications. We promised a lot of publications in this project. But in the end, I think we ended up doing this book for UCL Press. That's an open access book, and we also did a policy brief for the funder. So I think those were the 2 kind of big publications that we did out of the project. But within the project, we had promised to do a kind of audiovisual something to the funder, and what we thought to do, at least for the part that was being done by DPU and Makerere, because we were working with Makerere University in Kampala. DPU was specifically in this project. We thought to do a kind of internship where we would give an opportunity to a DPU graduate to go and work with the Urban Action Lab at Makerere University to make some sort of audiovisual representation of the issues of the project and the project itself. And also to help to build the capacity of the Urban Action Lab and its sort of young researchers to maybe use kind of video techniques and things like that. We had that idea. So David McEwan applied, among others, and won the internship for this. So he spent 3 months in 2015, 2016 in Kampala doing this film, and also he worked with ACT Together on their Know Your City campaign, sort of doing work on bringing together some of the information for them, working with the SDI and federations there. And David McEwan, he's done a lot of different things in DPU, and continues to do a lot of very interesting work. Yeah, so that's it for the movie. That's it for the preamble, and we can go on to the film, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, very briefly, this what I'm gonna show today is the outcome of what has been for me probably the most productive partnership in which I've been involved, which is between academia and an NGO, an external body, which by coincidence probably also because it was formed and led by DPU alumni. But and something also quite interesting that you will see about what was possible in this project and this kind of work, I think was partially the outcome of the fact of my hybrid role. On one side I was the academic lead, but I'm also the chair of this NGO, which is a charity. So I think that's creates a very kind of smooth cooperation between what the university can do and when the university has to stop, and a more action-oriented body, like in this case an NGO that is a design studio can do. What we tried to do in this first project, participatory spatial intervention, was to try to add a diversity and intersectional perspective to a participatory design process. And what I think what we look in this video particularly is both at the impact of the process and the impact then of the built intervention at the end. But what we are really interested in is this interaction between these kind of impact, is how the process affect the outcome, and how then the results, the built environment results and transformation is of a different kind and can have a different impact precisely because of the process that created it. And what we have here for that is a bit different from other projects is that we have been able to go back 2 years later and see what has happened. And so after every steps we release a short documentary. So in a way you have one where all the kind of participatory process is taking place, one that shows the project implemented, and the one that when we came back 2 years later to see that combination of process and build project, what that has left to the residents. And then lastly, there's another little bit of something that is connected with this, that is how we systematize the learning from these and many other projects, as well as a specific research project, into a toolkit, particularly on co-design built intervention with children affected by displacement. And this toolkit, again, this video, the last little video is a sort of summary of the key messages out of this toolkit. And the idea here is we did this toolkit as a solution to a problem. So we've been working a lot in this participatory intervention in humanitarian context with children, but different, and this involves a huge number of actors. But we always found that some actors found very difficult to understand the rationale for why we were doing things in a certain way from a different perspective. So we want to have a place where not only the different actors could get inspirations and ideas by looking at many projects, many case studies. There are hundreds of case studies, lots of methodology, methods, but also the rationale of how the things fits together. So the typical example is what we do in these projects. We hire local labor and we buy all the materials within 5 kilometers, and that's boost economies. And if the project is for refugees, then local people can change their minds in thinking, oh, refugees are a burden, into actually I'm getting my job because refugees are here, I'm selling more of these. But often this is not understood, for example, by someone in a procurement office of a UN NGO, of a UN agency. and certain things, maybe people who work in child protection do not understand the architectural constraints, and the humanitarian architects, they just want to build as much as possible with a little money and don't understand all other different elements, and then you have mayors, etc. So the idea of this toolkit is really giving this sort of a understanding of the complexity and the linkages of all these roles, of different possibilities, and so hopefully there will be some messages in there. Okay.
I won't talk a lot, just to introduce the context of the next film, which actually has a lot of continuities with the last one. It was a sort of inclusive design intervention, but just to give you a bit of the context of the research that it linked to. So this film is from an intervention which was part of a research project, part of a program called 80-20-30, which is led by the Global Disability Innovation Hub, which is partly based in UCL. And we were running, a group of us were running a sub-project. So that program is looking at access to assistive technology, extending that globally. But we were looking at a sub-project which is looking specifically in informal settlements, and we were working in Sierra Leone and in Indonesia, the experience of disability and how disabled people in the context of informality get access to assistive technology. So it was with an organisation called Kota Kita and their partner Kaki Kota in Indonesia. We also have partners in Sierra Leone who I won't mention. The GDI Hub and another organisation called the SHM Foundation and a team from DPU. So just to give a very broad overview of the main research project, it was in two phases. So the first phase was mapping the selected aspirations of people with and without disabilities in the partner communities. We were working in 4 informal settlements, 2 of which were in Indonesia and 2 in Freetown and Sierra Leone. And the existing community-led responses to support those aspirations. So it was really mapping out the existing context and what was going on. And at the end of that phase, we identified in the 4 communities aspirations that participants in the project wanted to work on for an intervention. So the second phase, based on this sort of mapping, was co-production of broadly assistive technology-related interventions. So just to give you an idea, in Freetown, they wanted to end up working on affordable and accessible healthcare, and I'm not going to talk about that now. That was different. That's not the relation to the film. But in Banjarmasin, which was the city we were working at in Indonesia, which is in the Indonesian part of Borneo, they were keen to work on an intervention related to an inclusive public space. So the film we're going to show is about the co-design of that inclusive public space. Just some reflections on that, some things I'd like you to think about in the film that I think are interesting is the process they talk about, the design process, which is a bit like what you just had in the last film, starting from a child perspective, was building on the idea that someone called Joss Boys, who's an architecture at UCL, has used this term of centering what she calls disordinary users. So starting from the experience of particular users with disabilities rather than designing a space and then retrofitting inclusion. So really starting from the more boundary users, but then including other people. So actually, the way we did that, and you see this in the film, is using personas as part of the design process based on the lives of people with disabilities and AT users that have been documented in the mapping in the first phase as an input into the design discussions. But what was really important as well is it wasn't just using personas, it was also having the presence of those people as well, because there's been a big sort of critical literature of looking at personas as a way of displacing disabled people's own voices, so then they sort of get displaced. So that's part of it, and you'll see how that works in the film. Secondly, the inclusive design was based on very locally determined and negotiated priorities, not a template. So when you look at the building that's designed, it doesn't look like what you'd expect an inclusive building. It's got very steep steps and a double floor, which actually looks odd, and it's related to the importance of the space, but actually there was a particular logic there that the upper floor is used by a group of deaf people who work on cloth making, and actually they preferred being somewhere a bit sort of away. So you'll see that in the film. I think one of the principles we're working from is that the sort of disability inclusion, again, rather than being an add-on, promotes wider social inclusion. So actually the priorities of the disabled participants were actually really important for other AT users like elderly people, people involved in care relationships. So you can see how starting from what Boys calls the disordinary users actually has wider ramifications for other people. And I think the other thing you'll see in the film is that it was using disability as an entry point to mobilise around public space as a very important wider community concern. So actually, in the film, they talk about it a bit politely because the film was made in collaboration and to try and bring in the sort of local municipalities, so they couldn't be as bold about it. But actually, in the community you're looking at, there'd been quite big protests around public space being encroached on for a waste transfer site and public housing. So actually, public space was a very hot issue and something the wider community had been mobilising around, but they hadn't got much traction. And actually, working with disabled people, because the mayor is part of an inclusive mayors global syndicate, actually it was a good way to get attention to this topic that they hadn't been successful in other ways. So looking at that. So just some things to think about in the film, when you see the film, that maybe don't come across that clearly.
So, folks, I'd like to introduce you to a film called Indefensible Space that was made with a set of partnerships. The filmmaker, who was called a mentor filmmaker, and I'll explain the reason why, was Manish Sharma. There were participant filmmakers, 27 community members who were named and you can have a look on the website here. And this was part of a project which involved Nyreen Darwala from the Society for Nutrition, Education and Action Health, SNEHA. She was at the time the director of a Prevention of Violence Against Women and Children program that was run by SNEHA. And she was working with David Osran at the UCL Institute of Global Health. And I joined them for this project because of other work that I'd been doing both in Mumbai but also in South Africa and in other places, which linked to the work here. And our research associate for the project was Laura Hurst. And this particular bit, although David Osran and Nyreen Darwala had been working together for a long time as part of a long-term piece of work on violence, this particular project for the film was funded by UCL Grand Challenges in 2014. So the aim of the film was to make a participatory film that would show the problems faced by women, men, girls and boys related to inadequate or absent sanitation services, with a focus on the space that this creates for gender-based violence. So for us, the element of the indefensible aspect of the space was both to do with not having proper sanitation, but also having the double vulnerability of facing gender-based violence. And the idea was to do this film to highlight the strategies that women and men and girls and boys have developed to deal with this problem individually and collectively, and to get their views on how things might work better. And then a sort of wider aim was to contribute to building accountability of government related to the provision of safe and secure sanitation. I think what was interesting about the framing of this project is that it was set within what has been called the Dharavi Biennale. The film is located in Dharavi, which is, at the time, was one of the largest slums in Asia. I believe it no longer is, but it's well known in that in the city of Mumbai. It really involves a lot of people who live there, and the Dharavi Biennale was a public engagement project by SNEHA. And what the aim of that Dharavi Biennale was creating circumstances that foster conversations around health through art. And they had the other aim was, in a way, to change attitudes towards people who lived in Dharavi. So it was to dispel prejudices about Dharavi by focusing on developing, polishing, and displaying local talent. So we did a literature review in the way that academics do in order to frame the issues, and then the filmmaker, there's a mentor filmmaker, ran a 10-day workshop, which in the context of the Darovi Biennale was called an art box. So every activity that happened in the Biennale took place within what they called an art box. In this particular 10-day workshop with the 27 community residents, they were shown how to use a camera, and they collected footage during the workshop. So they collected footage, looked at it together, and discussed it, and I think at the same time then also through discussions went out again to collect more footage, and so there was this kind of constant framing, reframing of what was happening, and people learning more and more about how to use cameras and how to capture things that were happening in their neighborhoods. They made then a 20-minute film that highlights the problems and strategies around gender-based violence faced by women in Darovi because of lack of secure and dignified toilets. And you can find this film on the DPU website, but also on the website of the Darovi Biennale. And I would, it's a very interesting website, the Biennale website, so do go and have a look at it. So with this in mind, then, just to say that this was actually shown at the Darovi Biennale. We also had an event here at UCL, and the film is used in teaching and capacity building more generally. And I would show it to you now, and hopefully I can get there here.
So can I request all the panelists, the filmmakers, the film producers to come and take a seat? And yeah. So yeah, a huge thanks to Cassidy, Andrea, Karen, Julian for sharing with us the product of really fantastic research that you have done. Thank you for your introductions and walking us through the intent of the filmmaking, of the context in which these projects came about. I'm just going to, we have very little time, but I'm just going to share some reflections on having watched the films, but also hear a little bit from a little bit more from you on the process of it, and maybe if there are some questions, and have a discussion around that. So all the films very clearly have a common thread. What was really striking is the way the visuals and in the way all the films captured vulnerability, ranging from the environmental risks in Kampala to dispossessions associated with displacement, to vulnerabilities associated with exclusive public space, as we see in the case of Indonesia, and then in Mumbai, where we see that was so sort of gory to see the first images of the film, to see how accessing some of the basic life survival necessities like sanitation is associated with such deep forms of sexual violence. But what was also really what also stood out for me in the films is this capacity to act, in the way they show that no matter how deep rooted the structural constraints are, that people have agency. I think that comes out very clearly in all the films. I think what also there's another layer to all the four films is the participatory approach that you take in your research projects, and definitely, Karen, very interesting is the way the filmmaking itself is participatory, and something that which sort of draws lessons for policy is people's capacity to act. So right from the frame we see, and there are different areas in which this ranges right from the framing of the problems, how the community is at the center of framing their own problems, to the process of collective organization, as we see in Andrea's films, and the messy process of building bridges across the competing interests in the communities, to the power of centering communities at the center. I think that comes out very clearly in this capacity to act. What, apart from the fact that there are thematic similarities between films, particularly Julian, yours, and Andrea's, very clearly the spatialization of spatialization aspect of sort of capacity and vulnerabilities, very clear. In some ways, I think, Karen, your film and Cassidy's film also speak to each other in looking at ideas of risks and how risks are framed, and in sort of generating the responses to act around the risk. What moves me equally, of course, are the visuals, sound effects, and I think affectations. Particularly, I'm thinking of where I think Teddy is saying, this man has said that where do we go? This is our home, and this is something that runs throughout in the four films, but also sort of reminds me of some of the contexts in which I do research, where communities are existing in really vulnerable and precarious conditions, but they keep saying that where do we go? And I think all the contestations arise from there. The fact that that communities are expressing their affectations, their attachment with a particular place, with the particular practices, and I think that itself is an expression of the capacity to act. And I think there is a lesson and insight for practitioners and policymakers to draw from that. Of course, these films show the human side of people, whether it's children that we see, and we see that also the fact that, of course, we are talking about vulnerability and capacity to act as two maybe opposing frames, but the fact that people's lives are existing in between those, and what is really interesting is the fact that structural constraints, whether it's a result of power, is not absolute. And that can be and I think these participatory processes are a very big sort of eye-opener towards that power or these structural constraints can be worked around. So I think what really is my question, and I think I'll sort of link it to Karen's processes of filmmaking, and it's a question to all of you, is that how does participatory processes play as a part of the filmmaking process? So in the way you film, and how does the script emerge, script evolve? So if you can talk a little bit about that. Anybody? Maybe Julian?
Well, I could start. I mean, in a way, the film that you saw about Calais and Barat, I think the filmmaking process itself is not especially participatory, but it's embedded in a relationship which has been going on with the people you saw in the film for a period of years. So I think the filmmaking process, actually, Kotikita, the organisation who led on that, they work and they run something called the Urban Citizenship Academy. So actually their whole ethos is about working with people in order to engage in citizenship practices. And I think their filmmaking is part of that. And in a way, I really noticed the difference between the films. So if you look at Karen's last film, it's much more making visible these sort of critical problems and the challenges, whereas actually the film made by Kotikita, and I think Andrea's is a bit similar, is in a way aimed towards an audience of municipal authority. So in a way it feels a bit more like an advert almost. And there's a reason for that, because they're trying to do that. But in a way, I guess the participatory element is the issues raised are part of a long research collaboration and actually sort of advising conversation with people. But the process itself, I think, actually is very much led by Kotikita with a very clear intention of fostering institutional change.
Well, in the case of indefensible space, it was made in a participatory way, and that was the purpose of the Biennale, the Dharavi Biennale, was precisely to set up spaces where people would get involved in the production of art of all kinds, in order to promote that link with health and art, and to raise the awareness of the community, but also to showcase the outputs of the community to the rest of Mumbai. And they took a decision that the Dharavi Biennale took place in Dharavi. They didn't show this in places other than Dharavi. And this was a conscious decision, to get people to come and see the part of the city that many people in Mumbai don't go to visit, but also then to show what's possible, what people can create when they do these things together. And so that was one dimension, but the other dimension was also the discussion that it led to amongst the participants, but also more widely with the groups that Sneha works with.
Andrea?
Yeah, maybe just one sentence really. I think in my project and in my career I've used video in two ways, either as a method, and so a participatory method, or in this case to documenting the participatory process precisely with more of an advocacy aim. So perhaps the only element of participation was that particularly the last film was very much wanted by local people there. When we said, look, we have some money to do a little bit of research afterwards, we just went with the questionnaire and more, we engaged them, can you go and interview other people, and they said no, we also want to do a video. I think this has been done, as Julian said, I think for us, and also the idea why you saw 3 little pieces is because for us, it's really not it's not even a documentary for us. It's really documenting the process to show other people why it was important to have this element of participations, because for us it's the most costly part in these projects. But particularly in the humanitarian situation, you have any situation where people say it's actually, a school cost $50,000. Why do you want $70,000 and use $20,000 for the participation? It's a waste of money. It's not efficient enough. There is not enough. And so for us, all this process of documenting all this that went through all the movies, including the last one that is almost a spot for this toolkit, is to say all these things that you see people moving and talking are very important. They profoundly change the social relations in a place. So yeah.
I think in the situation of this film about Kampala, the video itself was not done through a participatory method. David worked with with Teddy and the other young researchers at the Urban Action Lab at Macquarie. And the idea of that group at Macquarie is that they work very closely with different community organizations in Kampala, as well as with the Kampala City Authority. So their idea is to sort of build up kind of knowledge and different ways of working together on different activities. And for example, they had a project in the No project that came after this one. So that was on using waste to make energy briquettes. So they have the Action Lab sort of works through participatory processes, working with particularly with Act Together, which is the NGO that supports the Ugandan Federation. And then you saw in the video, I think, different elements of that kind of participatory process, like they were talking about the rubbish collection community services that they were developing in Boise, and also this kind of negotiations around moving houses in order to build these community drains. It showed in the film quite fairly rapidly, but that there was these drains that were built to try to reduce the flooding problem in Boise, and that this was quite an interesting participatory process that was mostly led by the municipality. So yeah.
I'm wondering if there are any questions from the audience.
perhaps just a brief comment that I think all of the movies, based on their own context, tells us about how every context understand what participation is. So in Indonesia, which is I come from there, talking about participation means you need to talk with everyone, and when there is some tension, the word leader will solve the problem that participation means. But in current context, I think a little bit different, which a huge kind of tension. So yeah, I think that's very, very, very interesting.
Yeah.
I was just wondering in terms of, I think some of the films cover quite a long time span,
Yeah.
and it seems to me that from my own experience, the pace at which these work tends to be very long in the sense of, if you pay for something done quickly, you get a project manager, that happens, boom. But obviously, that's not the point. And the question then is kind of, how do you best, obviously through the films you're trying to document it, but how effective have those films been in changing perceptions for authorities? Because they're obviously trying to do something. And I just wondered whether you've seen or heard of any change in perception, development of policies and things, because obviously it's trying to influence something, isn't it? Other than just actually maybe it's like a catalytic action. You demonstrate it once and then you just allow it to grow at its own pace, and then you don't have a concern, a long-term concern.
I think it's a general question for everyone in terms of the change, you see.
I mean, I think in the case of Indonesia, again, it's critical the role of Kota Kita, who were the people who made the film. That's really a snapshot in one of their interventions, but actually, so for example, in Banjarmasin, the city that was in, they've done a series of projects, and actually this is sort of building their relationship with the mayor, and actually then the mayor's become involved with a global compact of mayors of inclusive cities. So in a way, I think it's really important in terms of keeping up pressure on those processes of change. And part of documenting that means that becomes visible, that becomes a sort of proud point of the municipality. And so it's sort of part of building a process. And it would be interesting to see, if they could link all those things together and map how they've built into the bigger stream. But this film was a sort of snapshot of a particular bit, but had been built on work they'd done before with UNESCO on documenting disability in the city, and then they subsequently did something around inclusive schools for disability. So, yeah, I think it looks like a one-off thing, but it's part of a much bigger, long process of engagement.
I think Andrea's film also speaks very closely to that, because you're documenting the temporal changes. You kind of go back after 2 years to look at what has been the changes, and I think that's a really interesting way of engaging with visual methods.
But if I understand, the question was about the impact of the movie itself, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess that the movies, apart from the one in Lebanon, which spanned over a long period of time, there was a very clear sort of progression. And maybe in certain cases the funding doesn't permit you to do that. But I just wondered whether the fact that when you see things a one-off in a short period of time, it's difficult to really understand what the possible impact would be. Or in Lebanon, it's quite clear because you're literally seeing that maybe that luxury is not available in many cases. I mean, I get the feeling that my own sort of work is that you tend to go in presuming everybody knows everything about something, but actually you can't presume that people have an understanding. And I guess it's where the audience is of this film, isn't it? Is it, you're speaking to the informed, and in a sense you're just pushing them a bit, or whether you're opening them up to a much broader discussion about, just revealing a whole series of activities of which you're just documenting one. So I didn't really see anybody demonstrate your example in Indonesia. Obviously there is other things, but I didn't come across in the film, and I just wondered whether that was a conscious choice or just what limited your parameters, I guess, for documentation. Was it
Perhaps
just money or time, or was it kind of both one?
I don't think that these videos are meant, as part of the project, they are one output that goes together with other outputs. And in some cases, in some partnership, I think they are part of a longer partnerships. If I don't want to pick on Julian, but I think, for example, now we are working on another project together. I wasn't involved in that project with the same partner, and that on a slightly different team, but with a lot of connection. So I think there are long histories of change that we work together, and I think all these outputs are small steps. And for me, for example, they don't work. I don't think that I'm achieving one aim of the project, even the change in perception of certain institution only with the video, but the video then is linked with the other outputs. And I think all of these are important. So for example, for us, because there was this idea of changing the perception and importance around participation, even in context of emergency, where people say, it's so there's so little resources and so much need that we should cut participation, and instead our argument is exactly the contrary. Because of that need and because the strained social relations, participation will end up saving money because it can transform a relationship in a very good way and all the other things. But I think for us that was, together with other documentation, was a process then of or even shorter animation. You've seen an animation in the last video. That animation is also part of a 1 minute animation, because we needed all that through social media, through things, but that's created a lot of attention when we organize meetings, for example, at the World Urban Forums, and so that they were nicely attended, and so you get an audience of policymakers. You can do it if you have 10 minutes with the director of UNICEF, for example, then you can show a 2 minutes videos, and then you can have a conversation. Otherwise, if you go and talk about co-design built environment project, they can't visualize what you're talking to them. Instead, with those, they immediately have a visual, also aesthetics of the kind of things you're doing and what you mean, and then you can take a more serious conversation about, let's change the policy. And so, for example, I didn't say, but the toolkit was a toolkit published by UN Habitat and UNICEF. And UN Habitat and UNICEF, normally they like to do each one of them their own publication. So this was the first time they told us that they work together on the same publication with then a university in this kind of area. So in a way, it forced them to bridge two different approaches to the same problem that needed the experience of both, and publish one of their toolkit together. So I think, just.
Yeah. Well, in the case of the Indefensible Space film, it was part of a longer program by SNEHA and the relationship between SNEHA and UCL working on violence. And I think that it was seen in both having an immediate impact on the people involved, with the 27 participants involved and their constituencies. Where the discussion, it wasn't just an issue of a discussion of showing what was happening, but also the confidence to actually expose that situation and feel that people have the right to do it, and they have the right to engage with local government about this, and so in that sense it was it's important, but this is ongoing work, and I can't say that the situation in Dharavi has improved a great deal since then. There has been some research done since then on the same topic in Dharavi, and it shows slight differences from the impression that you get from this film, but I think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and it's obvious that Dharavi still has a lot of problems in this area. The film is also important for people working on water and sanitation, who don't necessarily think about gender-based violence when they're actually engineering infrastructure and building things. They don't think about the issue. And I think that was also an important part of the issue. And I've seen that all over the world. People build infrastructure, but they don't think of the consequences of it in terms of something like gender-based violence. And unfortunately, that's a condition that exists everywhere in all sorts of ways, all over the world. It's obviously not just Dharavi.
I guess the thing about a visual output like this is that it stays and in some digital form, and all of these, for instance, are open source. So from a research project, sometimes compared to a peer-reviewed publication, an output like this becomes a lot more generative and widely acceptable for people. I think it has the capacity to generate discussions. So it has you can reach out to a wider audience, and like Karen and Andrea and you were saying that it stays as some sort of an archive which is much more easily accessible and something that people can go back to, and as also like a chronicle of time. So I think it's really interesting. Sometimes these visual outputs can have more impact actually than any other traditional outputs from a research project.
I mean, for me, they're much more accessible than any written paper, and that seems the major triumph, because we're not a text-based community anymore anywhere in the world. I think it's kind of drifted on. We're looking at imagery, and I think that's the tendency for professionals is to create very complex thinking and complex diagrams and abstractions. And I think the films are quite successful in the way that they manage to capture reality and overlay that with a discussion about what's going on, but not just have the pure author's voice over it, but actually have local voice, which I think is much more, has longer, has a more authenticity than actually, the usual NGO coming in and saying, like, we're going to document it, type of thing. I think that was very successful.
I was thinking about that actually in relation to just looking again at Karen's film, the Indefensible Spaces, which I've seen before. I think that's really amazing for that in terms of really getting that sense and the sort of authorship and the cameras being by the people involved. But actually, having just been finalising the process for another project of doing the research ethics submission, I can see that there would be all sorts of really tricky things about that, because actually by opening up to a participatory process, you're losing control over a lot of the authorship and things that I think are becoming, for me, increasingly difficult to do because of the way our research is funded and because of the way ethics is structured, which is not always about ethical risk to participants and sometimes more about the risk to the institution.
But I think you can, I think this is the importance of working with local partners. And we weren't parachuted in to do this. It was an initiative from Mumbai, and the partners have been working on this particular, very, as you know, sensitive issue for a long time. And so I think you have to be led by them and by what they are willing to do for the issues they work on. And I think that's pretty much how we try to conduct all our research. To take the lead from local partners, and they know how much and what to say and how much people are willing to show and talk about, and when confidentiality matters, and obviously the question of do no harm is still absolutely fundamental in all of it. But I think that's that.
Just a kind of follow-on question for that, because I was immediately thinking that I know it's all global south type of trajectories and what's up, but I still think kind of the test is, could you apply this in a European setting, and what are the barriers there? Because to me, I think there's a whole lot of other barriers there which don't even rule out any involvement of people because of just the nature of a local government, etc. It's just not acceptable for an NGO to go in and start. You'd be called an activist, and you'd be kind of. I don't know if that's. Obviously, it doesn't sit in. DPU doesn't really do that work in the Western Hemisphere.
No, we do work. We do work in London with NGOs, and I don't think that's a barrier at all.
But could you imagine a film like those films being produced?
Yeah. Yes, I can. Yeah, and we've done that too. Yeah, I think you can. I mean,
Barbara's. We had films.
We have films
earlier
that do work like that, and again, the lead has to be taken from the local partner. So even though we are based in London, but we work with local partners in different areas in London and sometimes beyond. And again, it's a local partner that will it's usually an issue that the local partner is passionate about and is already doing activist work around, and they will then, take the lead in how to frame that.
We have time for one final question, one final thought. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess maybe more of a comment really, but yeah, it was really fantastic seeing and listening to all of those different films. I work in the water and sanitation sector quite a bit, and I've been to New. I know also that the government's been doing this the JJM to try and extend 24-hour piped water service to the whole country, and it's a huge ambitious project. but this really kind of revealed how far there are certain communities which are completely not seeing those benefits, and I really saw the level of frustration that came through in your film, which maybe in the other films they're sort of in a process of resolution. I was kind of curious to know if you see even they're meeting in the street, there's no spaces for them to have these conversations. I just wondered how, in that advocacy sense, were you able to kind of engage further with local government to see where that whole process is kind of going in terms of infrastructure upgrades and improvement?
I wouldn't say I have done that, but Sneha is doing that work ongoing, and there's the relationship between health and gender-based violence is an issue that is a continued partnership between UCL and Sneha.
I think
through
the
David
film also
Osrin.
showed a few local government offices.
Yes, it did. Yeah, it did show local government offices, and it also showed the kind of very kind of perfunctory bureaucratic response that often one gets in a situation like that. But I think that there are huge issues, and I think what you I don't know if you those people everybody who was going to the toilet was carrying water, because the water to the toilets wasn't working. The water to the toilet should have been working, but they weren't working. And so there are many barriers, to overcome, as you say, to do just the most daily activities of life. And of course there are waves of programs that of different kinds. Some of them donor supported, some of them Indian government led, some different kinds of programs that are constantly trying to address this question. And we also work with colleagues who are doing the most extraordinary and wonderful program in Tamil Nadu, where they genuinely have transformed water and sanitation through our colleagues working through the Indian Institute of Human Settlements. But it's not Mumbai, it's in another part of India. So it is possible to do these things, but it requires a lot of political commitment and buy-in, as combined with technical knowledge, expertise, and working with communities in a very close way.
Okay, on that note, we're going to say a huge thank you to all of you again, and it's a little sad that the film festival is coming to an end with this, but it's a really high, we're ending it on a really high note. So the recording of this, then the conversations as well as the films will be available on the DPU website, as the past films are also available. So if you want to take a look at what the staff and partners have been doing, take a look at the DPU website. And a huge thanks to Alex and Rita, and of course Karen for organizing this. So
And to you.
Thank you. I hope we'll carry this conversation forward. Some very interesting reflections on ethics and the knowledge production and dissemination that will come up, and I think we can't just leave it here. We have to take that forward, and we will be doing that. Thank you very much for coming.